And I'd like to introduce Erin Silva, who's a professor in the Plant Pathology Department and director of the Center for Integrated Ag Systems. She is here to present about regenerative agriculture. I'm going to make these short just so we can save some time.
And I'm going to set my timer.
Yes, so thank you. I might do that with my phone for the future. So let me just go hustle everybody in.
All right, well, I'll get started just to keep us on time. Like Mary mentioned, I am Erin Silva. I'm a professor. I work in organic and sustainable cropping systems. My position is as an extension-funded faculty. So a lot of my research is very applied, and I work quite a bit with farmers, not only across Wisconsin, but across the country, including those that I would say describe themselves as regenerative farmers. So it's an area that I've been working with closely over the last several years. I'm also the director for the Center for Integrated Ag Systems, a role I've had for just a little over a year now. I know I'm in the land management practices session. Full disclosure, I am not going to talk a lot about regenerative practices. And there's a reason for that I think will become clear over the next 20 minutes. I have my timer set, so I might talk a little fast because I tend to go over, but I'm going to dive right into it. So I want to just start a bit with the history of regenerative agriculture, but I do want to emphasize this is from a post-industrial Western mainstream ag perspective. And one of the criticisms of regenerative agriculture is it is very much coming from a white Western perspective, and it tends to ignore its roots in indigenous knowledge, indigenous production systems, including those within our state that has been demonstrated with the Menominee Nation geological history. Some research done here by Bill Gardner within UW-Madison that shows for thousands of years, indigenous cultures have essentially created regenerative systems and have managed to create resilience to be able to adapt to climatic variations. But the history that, again, I'm going to present is very much looking over the last several decades and emphasizing this post-industrial time frame. And even with the images of some of the people that have been considered pioneers in regenerative agriculture, you can see that it's really limited to white men, which is problematic, but it's going to be what I'm going to be stressing right now. So talking about where we first started to hear the term regenerative, again, in this post-industrial context, was the pioneer in terms of the terminology has been recognized as Robert Rodale. And you may have recognized the name Rodale as part of the Rodale Institute. And Robert Rodale was the son of the founder of the Rodale Institute. The Rodale Institute was founded in 1947 and was founded as a way to demonstrate and educate farmers and the public about organic agriculture. But Robert Rodale, as he got into the 1980s, realized some of the shortcomings of organic agriculture, not only in terms of its practices, but in terms of how it was viewed by the public and farmers. He started to use this term regenerative agriculture, and he described that. For the first few slides, I'm going to be doing a lot of reading, and that's because I really want to capture the essence of these people's quotes. And he describes regenerative agriculture as one that, in increasing levels of productivity, increases our land and soil biological base. It has high level of built-in economic and biological stability. It has minimal to no impact on environment beyond farm or field boundaries. It produces foodstuffs free of biocides. It provides for the productive contribution of increasingly large numbers of people during a transition to minimal resilience on non-renewable resources. So there's a lot of emphasis in terms of the foundation, the practices of organic, but really takes that in a broader way that isn't constrained by, at this point, there wasn't a national organic program, but what was considered recognized organic practices. But a couple of key terms here that I do want to emphasize is that regenerative goes beyond the soil and really is looking at an emphasis on biology more broadly, as well as some of the economic impacts. Richard Harwood was another person that was associated with the Rodale Institute. He was an agronomist and the director of Rodale Research. And again, the same time frame, around the early 1980s, he presented an international overview of regenerative agriculture at a workshop on resource-efficient farming methods, and this was held in Africa. And within this talk, he emphasizes the interrelatedness of all parts of the farming system, including the farmer and the farm family, so taking into a social component. And again, emphasizing biology, the importance of the innumerable biological balances in the system. Moving then again through the 1980s and recognizing and seeing where this term regenerative agriculture is emerging, I swear this guy, I'm going to do a lot of reading of quotes because this is, I think is what this paper was saying is it really resonates with where we still are today. And I think this is one of my new heroes, this Neil Sampson. He was a career conservationist with service of the Soil Conservation Service, which is now the Natural Resources Conservation Service, NRCS. He received a Conservation Legacy Award. But he wrote this paper that was published in the Environmentalist, Saving Agricultural Land, Environmental issue of the 1980s. And again, I'm going to read some quotes just because I think that this is so important as we look at still where we are today, 30 years later. So where he uses return to regenerative agriculture, we're talking again about environmental issues. He talks about, in addition to meeting domestic food needs, this feed the world concepts and a substantial export market, something again that we stress when we look at agricultural policy. A sustainable regenerative agriculture could reduce the waste and pollution of water, provide better wildlife habitats, slow the advance of desertification and soil salinization, reduce the loss of prime farmlands and fragile topsoils, and in general, make rural America a far more healthy, satisfying, and financially rewarding place to live. It is a utopian goal, perhaps, but an essential goal nonetheless. So much more broad than looking at regenerative practices related to soil, but really taking in some of the broader social context as well as the livability of rural communities. These are some of his recommendations. Again, I gotta read them because this is so relevant still today. We have not made much progress over the last 30 years from what he recommends, which I think are really spot on recommendations. We can take immediate action to overhaul national commodity programs. We could double efforts and incentives for soil and water conservation. We can encourage the development of soil and water conservation practices that result in soil and energy savings, and we can do it without resorting to indiscriminate pesticide usage, which could negate all the cost savings involved. And this really resonates with regenerative farmers today. And replace soil erosion and sediment pollution with chemical pollution, which is really one of the criticisms of no-till agriculture, that we are reliant on herbicides to be successful in no-till systems. And this is a trade nobody wants. We can create ways to help farmers ease off lands that are too marginal for sustained agriculture and eliminate current financial incentives to attack, I love the word attack such lands with a plow. We can set up intermediate financing bank to prevent a massive wave of bankruptcies created by the debt spiral in which farmers are caught. We can accelerate research and extension work in the development of on-farm techniques that help farmers wean themselves off of the industrial model that has them on current cost inflation treadmill. And this includes techniques such as crop rotations, organic farming techniques, integrated pest management, and conservation tillage. These techniques often have too little commercial potential to be attractive to industrial research and advertising campaigns. So they should be the primary target of public research in the USDA and agricultural research and experiment stations. And finally, we can be more aggressive at demanding as a people more sensitive use of water and land that sustains life. Such behavior is immoral, and it is time for the American people made it plain that this can no longer be tolerated. We know how to do it better, and it is time to show the political courage to do what must be done. This was in 1980s, and I still think this is so applicable to today, and these statements are still so true. Francis et al., moving into the 1980s, still looking at regenerative agriculture. This is considered one of the first peer-reviewed publications that talks about regenerative agriculture. Those of you that work in agroecology might recognize the name Francis, Chuck Francis. I think he's a retired professor now at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, also a thought leader of agroecology. He talks to her as regenerative as close to organic and low external input agriculture, and the associations of specific technologies and systems, including nitrogen fixation, nutrient cycling, integrated nutrient management, crop rotation, IPM, and weed cycling. So moving on to some of the other influences, these really resonate with farmers considering themselves regenerative farmers. There's a lot of history and resonance with the integration of livestock, grazing, and holistic management. One of the pioneering figures that regenerative farmers turn to is Alan Savory from the Savory Institute, who was working in Africa and saw the impacts in terms of land use change and the role of animals on the landscape. And this very much influenced kind of the thinking of regenerative farmers. Gabe Brown really took a lot of learnings and a lot of inspiration from grazing. And I think is considered and really brought a lot of these concepts of regenerative ag into the forefront. So he is a farmer in North Dakota, and is considered one of the regenerative ag pioneers. And in the mid-2010s, really started to become more prominent on the speaking circuit. He published his book, Dirt to Soil, which talks about the journey of his farm. And a big part of what he did on his farm was to reintegrate animals. So he changed his farm, and a lot of this was through the mentorship of a grazer in Canada, Neil Dennis. And he talks about what he did and what he emphasized, including living roots in the soil. Again, this idea of biology, feeding soil biology, using cover crops, using grazing, keeping something alive on the soil at all times, the outcomes that he wanted to achieve. And this really resonates with farmers, that they can reduce the inputs that they need on their farm. So this gets them off of this industrial treadmill, as well as allows for more profitability because they don't have that added cost on their farm. So he's able to reduce synthetic fertilizers, fungicides, insecticides, and use fewer herbicide passes. This kept his cost of production down, and he emphasizes how he changed his thinking to thinking holistically. And he was thinking about the long-term regeneration of soils and long-term profitability on his farm. Gabe Brown then with other leaders, really, this was around the same time we really saw an emphasis on soil health and this emergence of the soil health movement and the recognition and the of soil health within the farmer's mind. So again, this was around 2018, I would say. And soil health movement was really appealing to conventional farmers. And honestly, and someone working in organic agriculture for several decades, the farmers saw this, and I've seen this working with farmers as an alternative to the social baggage and biases of organic agriculture. Organic agriculture has foundations in soil and soil health, but soil health allowed for a lot of the same concepts, but not some of the other baggage and negative aspects of organic agriculture. But whereas organic agriculture, and this is part of the negative baggage, where organic agriculture is often associated with environmentalism and back to the land movement, and some of Rachel Carson in Silent Spring and the recognition of agriculture's negative impact on the environment, farmers, conventional farmers, many of them have a very negative association of environmentalists, and they want to stay away from environmentalists. They see that as part of regulation. They don't want associations as being an environmentalist. And soil health kind of took away that environmental framing, and it tends to have more of an emphasis on economic and profitability focus, reducing inputs, which oftentimes promotes environmental benefits, but yet doesn't, it's more of a focus on profitability. So a lot of what's been happening with soil health, certainly NRCS has played a prominent role, but what I've seen is a lot of what's happening with soil health has actually been happening and started to happen outside of the university and outside of Extension. So the Soil Health Academy, which this was a 2022 article. So again, this was about 2017, 2018 when this started to emerge. This was an effort that didn't include academics and really still has minimal involvement of academics. And my involvement with regenerative farmers, there's been many meetings, national meetings that I've attended, and I'm the only academic in the room, and that's on purpose. There's a real skepticism to academia, which is a real problem in terms of our engagement with soil health and regenerative agriculture. So the Soil Health Academy has played a major role in terms of engaging farmers, including conventional farmers, within the regenerative ag movement. Another key figure in terms of bringing soil health and regenerative ag to the masses, Ray Archuleta, another very prominent figure that has been very influential in terms of his messaging. He came from NRCS, he's certified professional soil scientist, left NRCS because he didn't necessarily agree with some of what NRCS was promoting. And independently, we started to work with Gabe Brown and some of these other pioneering farmers to promote regenerative agriculture. Again, very, very separate from a lot of that what was happening within academia, within our land-grant universities, and within our federally funded institutions as well. Regenerative agriculture, and I think this is one of the reasons why it's become such an industry driven and recognized by industry. There's been a lot of recognition in the popular media, including this Kiss the Ground movie. If you haven't seen it, it's an interesting watch. And this is a newer film, Carbon Cowboys. So highlighting the stories of these farmers that have adopted regenerative practices and telling the stories of how it's influenced their land and their farming, their ability to pass it on to the next generation. But a lot of what's happening in regenerative agriculture, again, has been separate from our land-grant universities and science and extension, is really kind of, I think, taken on a life of its own. Now, getting towards some of the certifications, and one of the reasons why I'm hesitant to talk about specific regenerative ag practices, unlike the organic standard, which is a national standard that aligns with global standards, and one standard that applies for every certified organic farm in the country. So you as a consumer knows if you're buying something certified organic, exactly what the farmer had to do. There's multiple standards to which a regenerative farmer could apply to. And these all have different requirements and different scopes. And we talk about regenerative practices, if we're talking it from a certification standpoint, they can vary. Depending on if you're getting certified through the Savory Institute, Regenerative Organic Alliance, Real Organic Project, they all have different ways of viewing regenerative agriculture. And this is, I know, super, super small, but what I want to emphasize here, and you can go on this webpage and see more detail, is that some of these certification schemes are practice-based. So this is like organic, where if you do certain practices and can verify certain practices on your farm, you can get the regenerative standard. And some of these, though, are outcomes-based. So you actually then have to have verified on your farm that you have been able to achieve what progress that the practices are supposed to provide. So whether that's increases in terms of soil carbon, increases in terms of biodiversity. So this is, I think, a debate that we need to continue to have with regenerative agriculture, and certainly a criticism of organic is that just because you're adopting the practices doesn't mean that you're providing any benefit. If we have a practice-based versus outcome-based standard, it certainly differs in terms of how that standard is set up, as well as the impact that that standard might have. What do these different standards include? So this is off the Syngenta website talking about regenerative farming practices. This is pretty minimalistic in terms of what we might see with regenerative farming. This is much more aligned to some extent with soil health principles that NRCS promotes. And Greg showed this in his presentation. Minimizing soil disturbance, keeping living roots in the soil, diversifying crops. Syngenta adds, though, precision applications of biological and chemical inputs within their regenerative certification scheme, and then integrate livestock. So obviously they took out one of the soil health principles there and substituted it with inputs. But so they're very much focused on kind of the soil health principles. However, there are other certification schemes that are much more complex. And in terms of regenerative agriculture and considering what are we trying to regenerate? Are we regenerating our soils? Are we regenerating our water? Are we regenerating our rural communities? They also include looking at elements including livestock and biodiversity and human aspects and financial aspects. So this is regenerative, certified organic regenerative by AGW standards, and then looking at the regenerative organic certification, looking at social fairness, freedom from discomfort, freedom from fear and distress, grass-fed and pasture-raised and different aspects of animal welfare. And talking to farmers that have tried to pursue regenerative organic certification, this social aspect can be very, very tricky and very, very difficult to be able to demonstrate practices and ways of managing the farm that adhere to this and can turn farms off of pursuing these regenerative certifications.
Are you near the end?
I am near the end. I have 2 more slides. I'm trying to keep on time. I have 1 more minute. So what I think as we look forward, we have to be clear with regenerative agriculture. If we're looking at this as something that we're going to be certifying towards, and if that we're going to be developing policies around, we have to know if this is going to be an outcome-based standard, what outcomes are we measuring? Are they dimensions related to soil? Are they dimensions related to water, biota, human dimensions, crop dimensions, or energy dimensions? And so last slide, in terms of the future of regenerative agriculture, again, I was asked to give a talk in terms of what are regenerative land practices. I still don't think that we can define what a regenerative land practice is. It depends on what we are regenerating, and I don't think that's clear. It depends on if there are certain outcomes that we're looking at trying to achieve. Are those realistic outcomes? A society, what are we looking to make progress towards? And I don't think we have that defined. Are we going to include social practices? Are we going to include animal welfare? At what point, if we're measuring outcomes, do we consider ourselves successful? And then an important question, who determines the answers to these questions? And how do we avoid the risk of greenwashing? Like that, not to point out Syngenta, but I mean, there's definitely, people can tool the different definitions depending on what they want to see as outcomes. And to avoid the use of regenerative as a marketing and political tool. Be happy to talk in more detail about any of that, but that's my 20-minute summary of regenerative agriculture.
Thank you so much.